Hello, in this video, I'm going to talk about epithelial tissue. All right, so epithelial tissue is also commonly referred to as epithelium. So in both cases, we mean the same thing, epithelial tissue, epithelium. So we have two types as a whole in general. We have covering and lining epithelium, which is epithelium that is the outer covering of the skin and the outer covering of some internal organs, but also the lining of many of our structures and body cavities. So anywhere that we have an outer covering of something or an inside lining of something, that is always epithelial tissue. Okay, so like the skin and the outermost part of the body, the mucous membranes inside the mouth, the lining and blood vessels, all of our tracts throughout the body of our many different systems, those are all lined by or covered with or both epithelial tissue. The other type of epithelium would be glandular epithelium. So epithelial tissue is what makes up the secreting portions of glands. So that includes endocrine and exocrine glands, which I'll talk about in another video. So we have endocrine glands that are producing hormones, exocrine glands that are producing other things. But in both cases, those secreting portions of those glands would be made up of epithelium. So general features of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is made up of closely packed cells with little extracellular matrix between them. Okay, so as I discussed in another video about connective tissue, we have fewer cells with a lot of extracellular material between the cells in connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is different in that we have many more cells very tightly packed together with very little space or material that is between the cells. That's because the purpose of epithelial tissue in most areas, all the covering and lining epithelial, is to protect and to separate. So it's our epithelial tissue is very often creating some kind of boundary between two spaces, or protecting some underlying structure. So we want to have a lot of closely packed cells that are able to tolerate a lot of wear and tear and protect structures that are underneath. So epithelial tissue is arranged in continuous sheets. So we have sheets of cells that are covering and lining different structures. And then, of course, we have glandular epithelium, which is not necessarily in continuous sheets, but most of the epithelium in the body is the covering and lining epithelium. Epithelial tissue is avascular, meaning that it does not have a blood supply. There are no blood vessels going to epithelial tissue. Instead, epithelial tissue gets its nutrients and oxygen and gets rid of its waste products through the connective tissue that is underlying the epithelial tissue. So anywhere that we have epithelial tissue, it's got neighboring connective tissue. So connective tissue has a lot of blood supply. It gets a lot of nutrients and oxygen and things. And those nutrients and gases and everything are able to kind of percolate through the fluid, the extracellular matrix in the connective tissue to reach the epithelial tissue that neighbors it. Okay, so everything that's being exchanged with the cells of the epithelial tissue is happening through the next door connective tissue. Yeah, so blood vessels that supply epithelial tissue are located in adjacent connective tissues. So an example of that, if you think about your skin, if you just have a scratch on the surface of your skin, that scratch only happened in the epithelial tissue. So that's why just a light scratch on the skin doesn't make us bleed. We don't bleed just from that epithelial tissue all the way on the surface. If you have a cut that's deep enough that you do bleed, that means that that cut went through to the connective tissue that underlies that epithelial tissue. Okay, so that connective tissue deep to the epithelial tissue in the skin is where those blood vessels are located. And for you to bleed through the skin, it means that it was deep enough to make it through the epithelial to the underlying connective tissue. Epithelial does have a nerve supply. So again, think about your skin. If you lightly touch just on the surface of your skin, you can certainly feel that. And that's because you do have a nerve supply in your epithelial tissue, which is important because that's a major way that we are detecting things about our surrounding environment and carrying that sensory information up to the brain. The epithelial tissue has a high capacity for renewal by cell division. So there are many, many epithelial cells that are all tightly packed together to form epithelial tissue. So we need to be able to reproduce those cells very quickly and very efficiently because there are so many cells and because epithelial tissue is located in places where there's a lot of turnover, where there's a lot of wear and tear. So think about the cells of your skin. There's a lot of wear and tear on your skin, which is protecting you from, all kinds of exposures. So we need to be able to produce those cells very quickly and efficiently so that we always have enough and that we're able to maintain those barriers. All right, so the ways that we classify epithelial tissues. We classify according to the arrangement of the cells and the shape of the cells that are in those layers. Okay, so first by the arrangement, so the number of layers of cells. Simple epithelium, simple just means it has one layer of cells. So a single layer of cells that functions in diffusion, osmosis, filtration, secretion, and absorption. So we have simple epithelium in places where it's not as much for protection, but more so where we want things to be able to be exchanged from one side to the other. So we'll have one layer of cells so that there isn't a very big barrier. So we can have like absorption during digestion, just as an example. So like the whole digestive tract is lined with epithelial tissue, but we want it to be very thin so that we're able to have an exchange of products between the inside of the intestines and the internal environment of the body. Pseudostratified epithelium is still a single layer of cells, but it's pseudostratified, meaning that it's like fake stratified, like it looks like it's stratified. So if we looked at pseudostratified epithelium under a microscope, what we would see is that the nuclei of all the different cells are all at varied heights. So when you look at a microscope, we would see many different nuclei, not all lined up in a row. With a simple epithelium, the nuclei of the cells are all lined up in a row. So you'd see one row of nuclei. In pseudostratified, the nuclei are at all different heights within the cells that are making up that single layer. So under a microscope, it might appear that there are 3 or 4 or 5 layers that make up that epithelium, but there aren't. There's still only one. So that's what makes it pseudostratified. Stratified epithelium is where there actually are multiple layers. So anytime there are 2 or more layers of cells, we would call it stratified epithelium. And so we would have stratified epithelium in places where there is more wear and tear, and we want to have more layers to have more protection against that wear and tear. For pseudostratified epithelium, it's not as much about protection, but more about being able to fit more cells with more nuclei into the same amount of space. So functionally, it's very similar to simple epithelium, but the difference is that we'll have more nuclei, more cells with more nuclei packed into a smaller space than if we just had one single layer. So they're packed into a smaller space, so it's more like metabolically active tissue where we need more cell nuclei to be able to do the work of the tissue. All right, then we classify our epithelial tissues based on the type of cells that make up those layers that we just discussed. So squamous cells, those are like squished. Squamous are squished cells. They're like thin little pancake cells. Like if you looked at an overview of a tissue made of squamous cells, it would look like a tiled floor where they're like flat, squished pancakes. So these are thin cells that allow for the rapid passage of substances through them. So they're thin little pancakes. So when there's only one layer of them, it makes it very easy for things to pass through those cells from one side to the other. We also could have many layers of squamous cells, like what we have in the skin. We have many, many layers of squamous cells, and that offers a lot of protection. In the skin, it's like they're layered on top of each other, like layers of shingles on a roof. So they're many, many, many layers thick, and that offers significant protection so that things can't get through. Cuboidal cells are exactly what they sound like. They're shaped like cubes. So they're as tall as they are wide. They're roughly cube shaped, although in the body, nothing has perfect 90-degree angles. So they're kind of cube shaped or kind of hexagonal, but they're roughly the same width and height. And then columnar cells are exactly what they sound like. They're like columns, much taller than they are wide. They serve to protect underlying tissues. And then finally, transitional cells. These cells change shape between being flat, like squamous cells, to cuboidal and back again. So these are special cells that we only have in a few places, mostly the urinary tract, a little bit in the reproductive tract. But these cells are meant to be able to stretch, and so when they stretch, they become more flat, like squamous cells. And then when they're not stretched and that pressure is relieved, then they return back to their more plump, kind of cuboidal shape. So like those are lining the urinary bladder, for example. So as the bladder fills with urine, it's stretching out the tissue that makes up or that lines the inside of the bladder, and it's made up of transitional cells, so that as they're stretching out and becoming squamosal or squamosal shaped. And then after we relieve the bladder, then it's able to return back to its original shape and the cells become more plump and cuboidal again. Okay, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you for the next one.